Karen, are you working your magic? Everybody's sitting here in anticipation.
We are now live on YouTube.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, welcome to the meeting of the Climate Working Group. This working group is set up to provide recommendations to Cabinet and full Council on actions and policies that can help our Council reach net zero emissions. Today has been arranged to listen to the expertise from our invited speakers, which we'll use to help us reach recommendations for the Council's tree strategy. The working group has been tasked with putting forward a plan for the Council to significantly increase canopy cover. This will help capture carbon as well as providing numerous benefits such as increasing biodiversity and creating habitats for creatures to live, making our city a great place to walk around, helping to promote a healthy lifestyle and improving our connection with nature and pride in our areas. Trees can also cause cooling effect, which will help to make our city a comfortable place to live with rising global temperatures. We are recording this meeting so members of the public can listen to the information shared. The recording can be found on our YouTube account. I would like to thank the speakers who have kindly agreed to join us today. David White from Forest Commission, Tony White from PECT, and Russell Horsey is an experienced horticulturalist. Each speaker will have around 20 minutes to present, followed by 10 minutes of questions. We should then have time to invite further questions after everybody has spoken. I'm very excited to discover more to help us set our targets and plans. So let's get started. David, you're first. Thank you. If you just do a quick resume about yourself, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
So Mr. Chairman, could I just?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
At the beginning,
Councillor Sanford. Sorry.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Because this is not a formal decision-making body, so we don't have to formally declare interest. But just in the interest of transparency, I would just like to say that I do know Tony because I'm a trustee of Peterborough Environment's 50 Trust. And I also know Mr. Horsey because I work for Woodland Trust and he does some work for us. I just think it's also worth noting that this is the first time that one of Peterborough City Council working groups has actually been held in public. And I think that's a really positive move forward. I think.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Sanford. Over to you, David, please.
Thank you. Yeah, my name's David White. I'm currently a woodland creation officer with the Forestry Commission, but I've been with them for nearly 31 years now in a variety of roles, working in woodland creation and woodland management and training. Okay, if that's fine, I shall. Oh, it's all happening.
As if by magic, David.
Yeah. Jolly good, because the one thing I haven't done in the Forestry Commission is IT expert, so that's very good. Thank you for that, Hannah. So yes, good afternoon. Yeah, as I said, my name's David White. I'm one of 3 woodland creation officers in the East and East Midlands. This is a relatively new role in the area and as part of the increased Forestry Commission staffing to encourage and assist more tree planting. Next slide, please. So why more tree planting? We're all aware of everything that's happening around the trees and trees and woodland creation. In the media, it's particularly active at the moment, but it's worth recognising that there are almost as many, if not as many, against trees than there are for. So the eyes of a lot of people are on us, and we've got to make sure that we do this correctly and that the trees are planted in the right place for the right reason. Next slide, please. So trees are planted for many reasons, as we've already heard in the introduction, but a majority of it will be based around climate mitigation somewhere, whether it's protecting people, biodiversity, soils and water. And there are many reasons for this. And when we're talking to landowners, they may not realise that they're going to achieve these. They may have completely different objectives. But a tree that's been planted for one reason will still sequester carbon, will still help mitigate against climate change. So there are many different reasons, and often these trees are achieving this without the planters actually knowing that. Next slide, please. So, as I've said, we need to get the right tree in the right area. One of the things we can do to start this off to begin with is the Woodland Creation Planning Grant. And this is a grant which is administered by the Forestry Commission. People will be pleased to hear that it's relatively painless to apply for. There are not 6 months worth of paperwork to fill in. It funds woodland creation, an investigation into sites for woodland creation at a minimum area of 5 hectares, and there is no maximum area. And there's a minimum payment of £1,000. It's split into 2 different stages. So stage 1 is very much a desk survey. Stage 2 is actually going out there and getting some more information. So there's a minimum payment of £1,000 for stage 1. And then you move on to stage 2, and there's a top up of at least £500 and often more. Next slide, please. So it's for collecting and analysing data. So it's seeing whether a particular area of land, a piece of ground that a person has got, be it the council or a private landowner, is a good place to create woodland. And it's allowing data to be collected. It's allowing consultation to take place with local stakeholders, expertise, other people that have got an interest in that woodland or that piece of land. And there's a designated woodland Forestry Commission woodland creation officer that's allocated to each case. So there is assistance out there. Part of it, the stage 1 is desk survey. So it's looking at computer information, stored information like magic, the Forestry Commission ecological site classification, which we've got here, which gives us an idea about matching trees to soil types and looking at predicted climate change. Also, things like historic environment records when we're planning the woodland to ensure that it's UK forestry compliant, and biodiversity records. And there's also tools such as climate matching, which allows us to consider that if we are going to look at climate change and consider putting trees in that are from a area 2 to 5 degrees south, that we get trees which match the type that we actually want to plant in that area or may want to plant. As the planning grant progresses, there's also a contribution for supplementary payments to pay for surveys. So, for instance, recently we've done archaeological surveys or funded them, priority habitat, surveys for invertebrates, surveys for breeding birds. And we're not frightened to say that this is not the right place to create woodland, or that certain mitigation needs to take place before planting happens. So the Woodland Creation Planning Grant is available there to help that happen. Next slide, please. So the English Woodland Creation Offer is a new creation grant which has come out recently. It's got quite a lot of interest, quite a lot of landowners looking to do planting under it. It's a minimum application size of 1 hectare and a minimum block size of 0.1 hectares. So it will fund shelter belts, that kind of thing. And there's a hope that in the future it will look at agroforestry and other bits and pieces like that. So it's going to be fairly flexible. One of the main things is that land must be free from existing environmental schemes. But our grants are often paid on a standard cost, and this is paid at 100% contribution, and we'll look at some of the standard costs in a little while. There's also maintenance payments of £200 per hectare per year for 10 years, and additional contributions for public and ecological services, and we'll look at those. Also available is infrastructure payments, so it could be for recreation for a site, so trails, various bits and pieces like that, or it could be forest roading to help actually trees and or extract trees on harvest. And you could retain the basic payment scheme if the land was eligible for basic payment. So next slide, please. So also, as quite a novel thing in a recent grant is that it can be used to create woodland by natural regeneration. Now, the suitability of this method will depend on what the objectives are of the scheme, the location of the scheme, and the seed sources available. But it's worth saying that woodland creation by natural regeneration is not a cheap, easy option for woodland creation, and it requires a certain ecological conditions and a commitment from the applicant. Next slide, please. So, standard costs I mentioned earlier. So just a couple of examples of standard costs. We've got supply and plant trees at £1.60 per tree per unit, and a new standard cost we've put in this time in an effort to reduce herbicide use is biodegradable mulch mats at £1.79. Then there's also tree shelters, which are £2 per tree shelter, and there are other standard costs like deer fencing, things like that. So if you were to plant a tree with a tree shelter, you get £1.60 for planting the tree, and you don't need to put a spiraling cane around it, and then £2 per tree for the tree shelter. Spirals are okay, but it's worth looking at tree wraps rather than spirals for a couple of reasons. I've done quite a bit of research on my own sort of experimental woodlands here on the farm that I live on, and they give multiple benefits. And one of the benefits is that they can be recycled afterwards, whereas currently the spirals can't. Next slide, please. So additional contributions. So if you're in a high nature recovery area, it's £2,800 a hectare, medium 1,100. And then there are lesser payments for water quality, flood mitigation. Riparian buffers is based around keeping rivers cool, and that's 1,600 a hectare. Proximity to settlement, so this is where you're in an urban or peri-urban area, but you're creating woodland with no public access, that's £500. And the recreational access 2,200. And these contributions can be stacked on top of each other. So you could receive a maximum of £7,500 on top of the costs for the trees, tree shelters, fencing, that kind of thing. And I'm just going to run through a quick mock-up example that I've done for your area. Next slide, please. So this is an area of woodland, I think, near Ferry Meadows or sort of that area. So it's just an area I picked relatively at random, but I did want it to sort of illustrate a little bit about what we were talking about. So this would be eligible for recreational access payments, priority habitat, and keeping rivers cool as well. Next slide, please. So a little bit of basic design. What I've suggested in this case is that there is two compartments, so 1A and 1B, and that 1A has trees inside a deer fence, so there's deer fencing around there and a couple of gates for access. And then 1B is an area of low density planting, so 60% open ground, with trees with tree shelters along the edge of the watercourse, which gives a better area for recreation. It's a little bit more open, and it gives the dappled shade that we'd like to see on the watercourse. Next slide, please. So these are the capital items for those sites. So on 1A, which is 1.7 hectares, you'd need 1,496 trees at 160 a tree, 540 metres of deer fence for that site, and 2 deer gates, which adds up to £8,115 10p. And then compartment 1B is a smaller compartment, 0.3. You'd need 132 trees because I've said it's going to be low density planting, and then 132 tree shelters. And that works out at 871.20. So the total capital grant to pay for trees, tree shelters, deer fencing, and gates would be nearly £9,000 on that site. Next slide, please. And then the additional contributions. So compartment 1, it would be eligible for recreational access. So that's a total of 3,740. Nature recovery, 4,760. And then the 10-year maintenance payment on top. Compartment 1B is a smaller compartment. And the reason we kept it as a smaller compartment is because the planting to keep rivers cool needs to be focused near the river. So only a small area would be eligible for the riparian buffer payment. So, and that amounts to 660 for the access, 840 for nature recovery, 480 for riparian buffer, and 600 for the additional contributions. So the total grant income per hectare for the capital and additional contributions combined is £11,733 per hectare. So just over 23,000 for that site. And next slide, please. So there is still countryside stewardship available, and probably the only time anyone's likely to use this at the moment is countryside stewardship does allow applicants to bring land in which is still in receipt of environmental stewardship scheme funding without having to repay back the grant. It will need to go through certain scrutiny to make sure that there's not a loss in biodiversity benefits, but normally that happens and planting can occur if it's acceptable for the other reasons. So there's a minimum block size of 3 hectares, application size rather, minimum block size of half a hectare and a minimum width of 20 metres. There's a cap of 6,800 per hectare, so it pays an 80% contribution. The maintenance payments are the same. There are no ecological services, top-up contributions, but you could retain the basic payment scheme payments if it was receiving basic payments. Next slide, please. So carbon guarantee, these grants do not preclude you from being able to sell carbon or enter into other sort of carbon-related grants or schemes. So there is the carbon guarantee, which is there to give a guaranteed price for carbon until 2055. Auctions are held throughout the year, and the applicant places a bid on how much they wish to sell the carbon for. There's no obligation to sell the carbon to the government if carbon prices rise, and I think they are likely to rise, particularly as we get further towards 2050. At the moment, they are not too high, but there are various people working to try and push the price of carbon up to a more realistic amount, which would fund woodland creation. The site needs to be registered with the carbon code, and it's worth remembering that carbon schemes are more cost effective on a larger scale or if they're grouped together as group schemes. Next slide, please. And the Woodland Carbon Code is a quality assurance standard for woodland creation projects, and it's independently verified, and it's basically verifying carbon units. The application will assess how many carbon units are going to be created by the particular area of woodland, depending on what trees are being planted, how they're being managed, how they'll be managed in the future. And this then allows you to produce a number of units for sale, and you keep 20% of the units as an insurance policy against pests and diseases, fire, sort of things which may limit your carbon that's produced. Next slide, please. There are funds out there for individual trees. So there's the Urban Tree Challenge Fund, large standard trees. It's related to match funding and requires 50% match funding. It's due to close fairly shortly, 25th of July. And there's also been other funds out there like the Local Authority Treescape Fund, which many councils have put bids in for that. Next slide, please. So, making the best use of the money. Now, what I'm not proposing is scrimping on quality, but if you get a grant, it's only sensible to try and use that money wisely. So, first off, don't rush with the planting. We get people put grants in and they're rushing through, and then they'll be planting in April. And that is just not a good idea, regardless of what you're planting. We tend to see a lot of early, sort of spring, summer droughts, and trees are not getting established, and you're losing a lot of trees in the drought. Soil-grown trees cost more. We're talking about 10 to 12p a tree more, but they allow more successful establishment, and they can be stored easier. Within reason, they allow a little bit more of a less experienced planter to do them, so they can be quite good for volunteers, things like that. And they should lead to less replacement trees being needed. So it's important early on to weigh up the benefits of that. Buy trees in bulk to reduce the cost of the plant. So if you're going for 50 different species of trees, then it's going to cost you more than it would do if you had a lower number than that. But again, that's not a reason to look at monocultures. It's just a fact of of what buying plants is. So consider planting more trees than required during initial planting. So it's going to cost more money to go back, check to see which trees have died and replace them. So if you put a few more trees in to start off with, then you can often remove the need to go back and do the beating up. You'll still need to do weed control, but you won't need to go back and do replanting. Also buying a smaller number of trees in and not getting those bulk discounts. Carefully match trees to the site. So when you're doing the site and the woodland creation planning grant, or even when you're just preparing for a grant, have a look at soils, look at microclimate on the site and consider all these things that are there. So I had a quick look through the Peterborough tree strategy this morning, and I think there was a case in there where it says no more than 10% of the same species to be used in creation. And I think that's an admirable sentiment, and it's certainly we're going away from monocultures and we're going into that. But I think with many sites, you would struggle to find 10 different species which would be equally at home on that site. And you may then have problems with some of the trees being stressed, some out competing, they're then more susceptible to pests and diseases. Get the weed control right. So often people plant the trees, sometimes walk away or just do mowing, don't consider other ways of weed control, and simplified design while still being UK forestry standard compliant. And this could be as simple as, well, you're using a deer fence, make sure that the deer fence boundary is an economical size to fence in. And if you need to do landscaping, consider tree shelters around the outside to break up these geometrical shapes. So next slide, please. So to conclude, a little time in planning and seeking expert advice is never wasted. We need to get trees planted, but it's always worth spending a bit of time planning, seeing what the site's like and getting this advice. There's never been a better time to plant trees. There are lots of different offers available, whether you decide to excuse me, go with the Forestry Commission or Countryside Stewardship or the Woodland Trust. There's lots of help and advice out there. Learn from others' experiences, and I would suggest in this part of the world, a trip to visit the Boston Woods Trust would be time well spent. They're an organisation that's been going for quite a number of years, purchasing land and planting it for public access in the Boston area for recreational facilities, and they're also doing sort of tree sponsorship. It's run by volunteers and wardens. And from an area of Lincolnshire which was quite anti-trees and very much the big sky, it's actually got a lot of respect in the area, so well worth a visit. Don't forget your existing woodlands and trees. So creation is the flavour at the moment, and very important it is, but you've got existing trees and woodlands. These need to be managed. They need to have soils protected from compaction. They need to be thinned to keep them in a stressless condition to make them less susceptible to pests and diseases. And the best time to plant a tree was yesterday, but the next best time is today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David. Much appreciated. Okay, I'll open it up to questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, if you've got a question, that'd be lovely. Thank you. Nick, please.
Yes, thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. And there was an awful lot of statistics in there, and I'm sure you'll be able to give us the slides so we can have a look at them. I just wanted to get really, you know, we as a group and I think as a council as a whole have said that we want Peterborough City Council to be much more ambitious as regards to tree planting, but obviously the thing that gets thrown back at us is the cost. So if we could look at that example that you quoted, where you said that you could get a capital grant of £11,733. How many trees would that involve planting, and sort of what proportion of the total cost would that actually cover?
Okay, so I think in that situation, that was 1,100 trees per hectare, which is kind of the basic. Because this is a capital item, you're not getting paid on a per hectareage. So if you're planting 1,100 trees, you're not going to be near the total cap. that's involved on it. I've looked at some figures this morning, and because this is a standard cost based on 100%, then that should pay for the trees, the planting, and the maintenance in the first year. So the figures that I've looked at here, so if you were looking at spiral and wrap with a cell-grown tree, you'd be looking at about £1.54, and that would be the cell, the wrap, the cane, the plant, and one session of weeding. And the supply and plant is £1.60. So if you went for bare rooted, then it drops to £1.43. But there are these benefits to cell-grown trees, which are not worth, you shouldn't dismiss those just because there's a few pence in it. So they're sort of very much covering the costs of what are in there. They're very loose figures, because a tree might cost anywhere between sort of 35p and £1.80 tree. If you buy an improved, a black walnut or something like that, then it's liable to be £1.60 a tree. If you buy a hawthorn, it's liable to be 30 something pence a tree. So there are those kind of things. If you went in to a tree shelter, so 0.75 tree shelter, let's say, if deer are not really an issue, then the total payment for that, for the cell-grown tree shelter, the post, the installation, the planting, and one session of weeding would be £3.03, and the total payment would be £3.60. If you went bare rooted, then that drops to £2.92, and the payment's still £3.60. On the flip side, if you have got issues with deer, and you need to go to 1.2 millimetre shelters, then in reality, you're probably going to end up paying sort of 10, 20 pence more than what the grant pays for. But in reality, you'll have some which are less. Overall, it should balance the books and should pay for it. Your maintenance payments of £200 a hectare then kick in for year 2, and that pays for your weed control for 2-3 years. And then also would pay for tree shelter maintenance and recycling of tree shelters.
Right, okay, just want to be absolutely clear on this, because we were given some figures earlier this year that to plant 1,000 trees per annum over a 10-year period was going to cost the council £250,000. So what you're saying is that that's not the case, because we could cover the majority of it through grant agency.
Yeah, well, certainly the UCO grant is 100% based on stand cost, and it's 100% funding. So, whichever figures that you get from different people, it very often depends on what trees are being used, what protection methods, other bits and pieces. But this has been based around real standard costs, and is sort of updated fairly regularly to make sure that it is relevant. So, yeah, these figures, as I say, as an overall project, the capital items should pay for the trees and the trees going in. Maintenance pays for the maintenance, and the additional contributions are kind of a figure on top of that for benefits, which are paid in a one lump sum after the area has been planted and when the capital items are claimed for.
Yeah, just one final question, Mr. Chairman. I was just intrigued by your mention of natural regeneration, because I certainly think that is something in ecological terms. It's really good because you can replicate the species in existing woodland. But you were saying it could be quite a costly process. I was just wondering, what are the costs involved that you refer to?
Okay, so costs involved may be some sort of ground preparation to begin with. It might also be that there's some deer protection needed, so it may need to be fenced to protect it from rabbits and deer, and also respacing of natural regeneration. Again, you're not getting sort of trees under stress, and you're ending up with a certain amount of trees. But it's more sort of also dependent on whether the circumstances are right. So what we're looking for with natural regeneration is that there is at least 3 species of trees that are capable of seeding, and we will accept ash as one of those, within 75 metres of the whole site. So if you came into this grant, a woodland officer would visit and they would assess whether this is likely to happen or not, because we're looking for natural regeneration to occur or to show signs of occurring within 10 years. Now, we're only looking at a relatively low proportion of natural regeneration. I think you're looking at something like 400 trees per hectare. And in fact, it may even be lower than that. But if it doesn't start to occur by year 10, there'll be a discussion on, well, actually, do we need to do any planting in here? We'll have another 5 years. Shall we do some supplementary planting? So I think the natural regeneration is really good. I see it as a bigger role, sort of maybe a mixture of planting and regeneration. It is, as you say, a useful way of keeping local provenance, but we also need to consider climate change and whether the trees that are local provenance are going to adapt quick enough to the changing climate.
Is that okay, Nick? Happy?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, also, I suppose there's no stop the council doing a carbon offset scheme on top of this either, is there? I suppose that would be quite beneficial as well.
No,
any more? Sorry, go on.
No, that's right. You can do those. The only thing you've got to be careful about is anything beyond carbon. So what you can't do is get additional contributions for, say, recreation, and then get funding for recreation somewhere else. Funding to provide that. So, but the carbon is very much can be stacked on top of it and used as additional revenue.
Yeah, revenue to put into the scheme, which would be good, I think. Councillor Robinson, please.
Thank you. So one thing I wanted to ask about was supply. So we're very aware that we would want trees that were from nurseries grown here in the UK for kind of biological safety reasons. But with so many local authorities and groups up and down the UK looking to large scale tree planting, do we run the risk that we might have a bit of a shortage of supply in the future in the UK, and would this likely impact costs?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. Yes, there could be. So there are currently sort of work ongoing at the moment, and part of the sort of new wave of staff that have been employed by the Forestry Commission are actually looking at that. So there's currently plans being put in place to, support the nurseries, encourage nurseries to expand, potentially even setting up new nurseries. So there is this kind of this is being looked at. It may be a problem in the short stage because with all of these trees, you need sort of 2 or 3 years to actually grow a tree, some 4 years and longer. But it's being looked at the moment. As well as a shortage in trees, we may actually have a shortage in people to actually plant these trees and manage the trees when they become established. So again, that's another thing that's being looked at as more people being trained up to come into the industry.
So can I just also ask, are you aware of any local authorities that might have begun or about to start their own tree nursery initiatives? And did you say that there may be something that equally could attract grant support?
Yeah, I don't know whether there is for smaller nurseries and setting up sort of nurseries, or whether it's just support for the nurseries that are already there, but it's still sort of work in progress at the moment. But I can look into that and see whether there is anything. So there's a lot of the trees are not too difficult to grow. I grow quite a few myself, but there is a certain amount of regulation and sort of paperwork and other bits and pieces. So, but yeah, I can look into that and come back and see whether there is likely to be anything for local authorities.
Thank you.
That's interesting about lack of trades coming through. That is worrying, really. But, I think something we need to address, really. Okay, yeah. Councillor Day, please.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. This is just a bit of clarification on the grant funding. So do you limit grant funding per area? So, for example, we have a big country park in Peterborough that's not actually technically run by the council. Could they apply for some grant funding to plant more trees? And could the council also apply as well, or is it limited per area?
Well, so you can't double fund. So if you've got a 20-hectare country park and one management group plant in one area, then there's nothing to stop the council planting in another. But what you can't do is plant the same area and both claim the money on it. So
Okay, thank you. And I just have a second question, which is about, you mentioned agroforestry, and I'm quite interested in obviously encouraging our farmers and to plant more trees on farmlands. Have you got any you mentioned it briefly, but I wondered if you've got any more information about that, of any projects that you'd push forward in that area?
No, at the moment it's still very much, it wasn't funded under countryside stewardship. There are a few places that have been doing this. Some of it's based around arable farming. So I believe there is someone in the Fens, name escapes me at the moment, who basically had to go and sweep up his topsoil off the road and take it back onto the field every year as it blew off. And he's now put belts and things around and reduced this. There is also quite a big scheme in Wales with hill farmers, Pont Bryn, I think it's called, where they've planted trees, copses, various things. So it's giving shelter to livestock. Also, in some instances, it's providing green browse and alternative feeding if there's drought and things like that. So, at the moment, the sort of nod towards agroforestry is allowing these small belts up to 10 metres. But I can see that as this develops, it will change into possibility of other things as well, but still very much on the drawing board at the moment. But there's a lot of good information out there on agroforestry.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Nicole, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, David, for such an insightful presentation. I'm interested in finding out this topic. Rather than relying on traditional grant aid, and given the council is always limited on funding and carrying out the necessary research, the planting and the management of tree stocks, what are the prospects of local stakeholders like yourself, the Forestry Commission, in getting more proactively involved and potentially in investing in a community municipal bond or citywide environmental fund to help generate the much needed finance to deliver some of these projects?
Yeah, I don't really know, would be an honest answer. I mean, there are things with Forestry England, who are our counterparts sort of managing the Forestry Commission woodlands, where they are entering into leasehold agreements with people who've got land that want trees on them, and they will plant them and look after them. But yeah, I'm not sure what the move is going forward for doing anything that you've said. I think our role at the moment is very much guidance and ability of grant aid and sort of a technical assistance rather than actually, don't think there's any plans at the moment to put sort of direct planting onto our table, really. There is a relatively small number of people in the Forestry Commission working full-time on creation. We're also sort of woodland management, plant health, various other bits and pieces. So at the moment, I don't think we've got the resources for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, David. I know this is slightly off subject, and you mentioned weed control. What's your opinion on herbicides, please?
I think within the parameters of what we're allowed to use, what's permissible, that herbicide use is very often sort of necessary at the moment, but we are looking at other methods as well. So for the first time, we've put mulch mats onto the table, and what we don't want to do is sort of litter the countryside with more plastic and more plastic pegs and various things like that. It's really a case, I think, of using weed killer or pesticides for grass control, probably to start off with, but doing it right and targeting it so that it's effective and you're putting in the minimum amount of herbicide on that you need. So, you know, if you can actually get it right and get trees away rather than, you know, there being a sort of, you plant poor quality stock, you do weed control, you plant it at the wrong year, it dies, you've then got to do weed control again, plant the trees again. There's the carbon sort of thing of planting 2 trees. So at the moment, pesticide use is very much a thing that happens in woodland creation. Obviously, you've got to consider water courses, other bits and pieces like that. But my take would be you can do sort of methods like low impact work with what we call a weed wipe rather than spraying, and you can limit the amount of pesticide and maximise the effect in the soil.
Thank you for that. Nicola, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a final question. My final question. If our council was interested in applying for the Woodland Creation Planning Grant or one of these grants, would we ourselves have to identify the land, or is that something you can give us some technical assistance and support on? And yeah, just wondering what the next steps would be, or for us, and how this might work within our citywide carbon management action plan, in terms of what we then put in it as an action to take this forward, if we're interested, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. What normally happens is that someone comes with an idea of how much land they're going to put in. So they may say, well, okay, here's a map of it. Potentially, we're going to look at 10 hectares, 20 hectares, whatever. And then we do some initial research onto that and look at these sites and say, well, okay, this one looks like it might be problematic. So we do initial, we've got what we call a policy and advice team. So there are water specialists, there are carbon specialists, there are heritage, social forestry, biodiversity and landscape specialists. And we run these schemes past them, and then they sort of flag up, sort of any showstoppers within that come on. So yeah, there would be some help certainly in sort of looking at these sites, but I think you'd have to kind of make the first step and at least give us an idea of where these things are. Otherwise, one of the staff could end up sort of lost in Peterborough for a week. So, and as nice as it would be, I'm sure they've got other things to do as well. So.
Brilliant, that's great. Thank you.
Nick, please.
Yeah, just one final question, because I appreciate we do have other people we want to hear from. I was looking at the reports that came out a year or so ago from the government's Independent Committee on Climate Change, and they were saying in order to get the country to net zero carbon by 2050, we needed to plant something like 100 million trees per annum every year by 2050. So I did a quick calculation looking at Peterborough's population, and I worked out that means we need to plant something like 285,000 trees per annum, whereas in our trees and woodlands strategy, we've got a target of planting 400 per annum. So I just wondered, as a question really, whether you could offer us any advice on what the sort of scale of planting should be that we should be aiming for, and should we be looking at planting a certain number of trees, or should we be looking in terms of expanding our tree canopy cover?
Okay, yeah, I think I would count trees in sort of number of trees. I think I tend to work in hectares or acres, depending on what I'm doing at the time. Canopy cover, no doubt you have a sort of explanation about how you estimate that, but I think I'd go for individual trees. And yeah, I think everyone's planting amounts are going to have to go up. It's going to be a difficult thing, and there will be some areas which can afford to plant more than there are other areas. I know I've been involved in some of the woodland management plans you've had for the area. Peterborough is already fairly well wooded compared to a lot of urban areas. So there may be limited places to plant, but yeah, I think there needs to be an increase definitely.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have quite a lot of tenant farmers in PCC. Now, if we could encourage them to plant around the fields with some hedging, I mean, obviously you're talking hectares, but could that be split into like, linear amounts of hectares, or doesn't that not work?
Yeah, so it's the individual block size can be 10 metres wide. So as long as you've got 10 metres of width, then it all adds up to hectares. You can sort of work over sort of multiple land holdings as well. So if you've got tenant farmers that are together and they're interested in doing some of this, and you're working with them to do that, then that makes a slightly larger scheme. It allows them to share expertise, to share the buying power of getting these things in, to get the planting done in sort of one stage, and see landscape scale benefits. So yeah, it happens. We've been doing the past 10 years quite a lot in the Peak District with the tenant farmers on the National Trust and the Cliff Woodland project, and they've been doing quite a lot of, relatively small bits of planting in some areas, but it soon adds up.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Yeah, I think I'm very keen to meet with the tenant farmers and to put this forward to them, see what they have to say. Really, I really appreciate David. That's fantastic and very informative, and I'm sure the rest of the group agree to that. Okay, thank you very much, David. Okay, we'll move on now to Tony Cook from PECT, if I may. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, if I may. Oh.
Tony, I've got your presentation. Do you want me to do it?
That would be great, thank you.
Okay.
So good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Next slide, please. Hopefully, PECT will require very little introduction, but I'll briefly explain a little bit about the organisation and what we do. Because PECT has 4 main areas of activity, and there is a lead person in each of those areas, and I think it will create a context to PECT and our approach to using public engagement events to deliver our projects. Next slide, please. I'm the Natural Environment Lead, and I manage the nature-based projects. We at PECT are delivering numerous projects across the major genres of commerce, community education, and natural environment. So my job as a Natural Environment Lead is to use 3 different areas of approach. That's conservation, protection, and restoration. Next slide, please. We use strategies to seek out and engage and promote awareness of the active conservation, and we protect the natural environment through projects that value the contribution and services that natural provides, and we do this with public engagement. Next slide, please. PECT's projects that I lead on through green infrastructure improvements usually involve or have involved tree planting, wildflower meadow establishment, community engagement events, awareness building and education, upskilling and training opportunities, and community improvement and legacy projects. And it's important because when we're proposing planting trees, we're proposing to do that with the public, and that will have a major consideration in the success and legacy of a project if it's fit in the urban environment. Next slide, please. So my role at PECT has a unique target. It aims to improve both the physical area and people's quality of life and well-being by being able to experience local nature. So as we approach the idea of delivering a greater number of trees to combat the climate emergency, we're also doing that in a way that engages the community and benefits the community too. So I think that's also important to note. And we do that by engaging directly with volunteers, schools and businesses to plant our trees. There are 3 main areas to the projects that we deliver, and these are people, place and nature. Next slide, please. So hopefully you'll be familiar with the Forest for Peterborough project. This is a project that's been running for the last 10 years. The aim is to plant 230,000 trees by 2030, and we hope to do this by delivering major tree planting events with the community, schools and businesses. And so we're already up to 108,000 trees planted, and we still got 120,000 to go. Next slide, please. And briefly, I also manage the local delivery of the National Beelines Pollinator Project, which aims to embed mini meadows across the city. These link up to form a network of pollinator-friendly sites. And it's also worth considering when we're putting in trees that we might also want to put in wildflower areas within these the areas of trees. One, because it benefits nature, and secondly, it also provides a beautiful backdrop to them as the trees grow. Next slide, please. PEC's projects inject the enthusiasm and so far have provided the funding. Working with community groups keeps the ownership of the project's outcomes within the control of the local participants. It ensures legitimacy of the improvements and contributes to a legacy of action. It keeps the project's benefits continuing after the funding project, the initial project, has stopped. So it improves places for residents by the residents' participation and is essential to the positive legacy of any project. Next slide, please. Urban tree planting schemes are vital, not just for the aesthetic improvements of the built environment, but their contribution to the intersection of noise and dust pollution. This improves air quality and also moderates peak summer temperatures. Being closer to and experiencing nature improves mental well-being, and through studies it has been shown to reduce stress and even reduce the time spent in convalescence. So the trees that we're thinking about in the urban setting are actually contributing to a number of different aspects to the quality of life for people across the Peterborough area. One of those, of course, is just the aesthetics of it being next to nature, but also that they're contributing positively to intercepting the dust particles and pollution that will hopefully then increase and improve the quality of air within the city centre. So that's also worth taking on board. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I think I've got to.
Are we back with you, Tony, or is that have we got a slide issue?
Is that one? Can you see this?
No, we can just see each other. We're all on screen now.
Okay.
Back on screen.
I'm going to try and share this screen. See if
Thank you.
Can you see that?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Can.
I apologise about this.
Okay, no problem.
Hopefully you can see that. So when we're talking of trees in a potential planned tree planting project, we often ask how many trees. So tree planting densities can be 1,000 to 2,500 trees per hectare. So a 250 trees with a tree planting spacing of 3 meters would cover an area of approximately 1/4 of a hectare. And planting at 2 meters, they would cover an area of approximately a 1/10 of a hectare. So if we were to plant the remainder PEC's 120,000 trees, that would require between 120 and 48 hectares of ground, which of course we don't have, and it's not something we're suggesting. But available land is a constraint to planting any trees in the urban environment. So the correct and appropriate selection of the area to plant on is critical to ensure that we can actually plant any trees. We'll go to next slide, please. Oh. So on our approach to tree planting across the city, we can look at tree canopy coverage as a way to decide where some of these trees might go. And you'll see on the screen that the difference in canopy coverage area across the city differs widely. So when we're approaching a tree planting project, we ensure the correct species are chosen, and picking up on the previous presenter, and also to take into consideration the actual characteristics of the site. One of the parts of the process we use to plant trees is based upon the structure that the trees will finally give whilst they're establishing. In an area where there are no trees, we try to establish a wide range of native trees and shrubs. This highly diverse method has the highest levels of biodiversity benefit. I like to use the analogy of a community growing together. So we try to ensure that we have lots of different species of trees growing together. In an edge line, so maybe we could think about on the periphery of an open green space, we would suggest widening the line of the trees that already exist, not necessarily across the whole length of the hedge line, but in part. And if it doesn't have any upper canopy trees associated with the hedge line, we would plant upper canopy trees in that hedge line. And where the canopy of the trees have already established, we suggest planting smaller, lower height shrubs around their base, and if possible, to connect those trees into a lower canopy corridor. So from that, hopefully what you'll take on board is that when we're trying to plant trees within the urban envelope, we often don't have major tracts of land. And so the previous speaker spoke about establishing maybe some of those bigger area tree plantings, which I think would be a fantastic opportunity for Peterborough. But also, we wouldn't necessarily preclude using the existing spaces. So I think there are lots of opportunities to plant across the city, but just on a smaller scale. And a way to probably explain that further is that if we looked at the cross-section of the image, we see that there are 4 layers. So there is an upper canopy, there's a lower shrub layer, then we have a herbaceous layer and a ground layer. And so the herbaceous layer and the ground layer are where we would plant our wildflowers. And the upper canopy trees, if they were already established, the shrub layer underneath them is where we would plant a secondary lot of trees. So we concentrate on the interspatial distances to create a dense under canopy to build a complex habitat to obtain a more natural, nature-orientated benefits. And so when we're delivering projects around tree planting, at the outset, one of the key aspects of it is not just about trees in the ground, but also about the nature benefits that it's going to provide. And so that's in terms of the complexity of habitats it's going to create. We can't get away from the costings of that. And so what on the screen you'll see that if we were to plant 12,000 trees a year, and including for a 10-year period, we would obviously experience the bottom end figures there. It's worth pointing out that there are other types of support in terms of community-based tree planting programs available. So the Woodland Trust provides community packs, and PECT have used those before with community engagement events. And so splitting an overall tree planting program across the city into separate community groups could provide opportunities for further assistance in providing trees. And one of the other benefits of splitting a program, say a 10-year program, over into different areas is that you're taking along some of those other social benefits that you're getting. You're engaging with the public, you're involving the public in the tree planting programs, you're hopefully ensuring that participation has created the right type of legacy to ensure that the trees are looked after and are valued within on the people's doorstep. So I think it's important when we're trying to establish trees that we're doing it in a way that can contribute not just for, say, the overall carbon targets of the city, but also the well-being and participation of the residents. Thank you very much. That's the end of my project presentation.
Thank you, Tony. Just unmuting myself. Sorry about that. Yeah, open it up to questions, please. If you'd like to raise your hand. Well, while people are raising their hands, I'm just going to ask a question. Okay, community fruit orchards. Have you ever thought about that, Tony? Just small areas, for community fruit. I mean, it just sounds a good idea. I mean, like I was saying earlier, there's some what we call ghost playgrounds. So it's playgrounds that are really gone into, really been run down, to be honest. So the land that we own and we've got that could be probably turned into, these type of areas. What's your opinion on that?
I've looked at some of the ghost areas, especially in the Bretons, where there's lots and lots of those. There is, I think there's significant opportunity to develop areas like that as small scale community orchards. I think there's also opportunities to develop those areas to have small scale wildflower meadows. I think you can bring that nature benefit into quite built up areas. I think there's an issue around the scale at which you plan to do something like that. Costs are also prohibitive. So we plant with whips, and as the gentleman previously mentioned, they have a costing in the £1 or £2, maybe £3 or £4 if we were trying to plant black poplar or something that's a little bit rarer. But an orchard tree might well cost £15, and so there are bigger burdens in terms of costs around establishment. An espalier tree might well cost £50, and what you also have is you want to ensure that there's an appetite for that. So it's not a project that's sort of planted on a community. It's a community wanting that project, because pruning apple trees and fruit trees and the like, it's a skilled job, and so that type of training and legacy and involvement takes time to develop. But I think there's no reason why that couldn't be a consideration. And also, like, you've got organisations like the Stamford Community Orchard Group, who are long, well-established organisation, and I've used them previously to provide 30 heritage fruit varieties for a local school, and so they wanted an orchard, and so we used that, not only the fruit trees but also those cultivars that are appropriate to this area, so which is quite interesting too.
Yeah, the local species are very good. Yeah, we're looking at a scheme like that in Thorney with the parish, and I think it's very good if we could roll it out throughout the parishes, or at least talk to the parishes about the idea. Anyway, Nicola Day, please.
Thank you, Chair. A really similar question, actually, to Councillor Simons in Alton Goldhay, not necessarily ghost parks, but we've got lots of planter beds with brick walls around them, they're crumbling, they're in disrepair, they're full of weeds. So, yeah, it'd be really interested. I mean, we've already regenerated one area like that because it was a hotspot for fly tipping, and the community really got on board. We worked with Up the Garden Bath, and we got a license from the council officers to just completely regenerate that space. And it really brought the community together. You know, some neighbours had never even met each other, and all the children were out playing while we were putting in a pollinator pop-up park. So, yeah, it's given a really nice, bright sense of colour and vibrancy to the area. But there are lots of other beds and planters which are just, you know, in disrepair as well. So, yeah, I wondered how, you know, communities can access funding to or to work with PEC to regenerate those areas, and what are the sorts of steps that are needed. And then my second question was about urban tree planting. It's really interesting, isn't it, in the spaces, you know, Fletton's got 4.7% of canopy cover, whereas we know that places like Bretton and Orton have got far more canopy cover. I just wondered, what areas are you targeting in terms of your urban tree planting? I'm thinking of areas like Lincoln Road and some of the inner city areas that need greening in terms of keeping them cool, and for all the reasons that you've talked about at the start of your presentation. Thank you.
In terms of when we approach areas that have got low canopy coverage, there might be some practical reasons why the areas are lower in canopy coverage, not through, say, necessary lack of interest. So if it's a very highly built environment, and there isn't an excess of open green space, it may be that most of that land is taken up by private ownership, say gardens. And so, if, for instance, PECT as an organisation, what we do is we establish tree giveaways. And so what we do is we open those up to allow people to come in and take a tree and take it home with them. And so what we'll do is we'll have a range of species there. So those smaller species, maybe crabapple, cherry plum and stuff, that maybe they grow to only 6 meters or so, rather than, say, you know, supplying people with oak trees saplings to take away that they're going to plant next to their neighbour's wall or something. And so it's important to establish where the trees are going to go and whether the species is appropriate for that. I think trees they embed beauty and awe in people, but they also are an element of conflict, and that they can be quite contentious. And so I think one of the things around urban tree planting is the legacy maintenance costs. And so one of those is around, you know, ensuring that, you know, trees aren't being planted within a certain proximity. We don't plant trees within 6 meters of a residence fence line to ensure that we're not in some way casting a negative element to a tree planting program. The biggest constraint PECT has, say, for tree planting, we managed to secure funding for the last 10 years, and so that's an indictment of the process that PECT have been doing. But the single largest constraint is land permission to plant. So we engage with the city council to plant, and it's a very positive process. But there's still more that we could do, and so we could work with obtaining an audit and going through. And so all those areas, as I've mentioned in my presentation, that have got sort of like those hedge lines that don't have an upper canopy tree, we could get trees in there and put upper canopy trees in there. And those trees that maybe there are one or two single trees in the middle of a very large open green space, maybe we can plant shrubs and understory species under there. And it's that correlation between structure and nature benefits is the thing that drives us to plant in that way. And so, you know, structure is positive correlated with bird species and invertebrates, and so we want that process to. We're not necessarily wanting to establish thickets across all of the city, but there is a lot that we could do, and there's a lot of areas that are also managed municipally, you know, that they aren't being utilised for anything really other than, say, maybe cost centres for the council's contractors. And I think some of those areas could be utilised better. You know, we see in quite built-up areas that are supposed to be set aside for maybe hedging plants that are, in a poor state of repair, and they're maybe, they're managed to ensure that they don't come out of, they don't become problematic. And I think there are ways around the management, but also you have to take on board that people's perception. So when we're establishing, say, a wildflower area, it looks nice when it's in bloom, but not necessarily so great when it's seeding. So engaging with the public over a longer period of time changes those perceptions. And for some people, it might be a paradigm shift. We might have to radically change what they perceive as benefit in nature. People still perceive, say, a species of plant as a weed, but actually it might be very beneficial to nature. And so it's it's about trying to balance all of those aspects. But getting permission for land is obviously, for us as an organisation, more difficult. And it sounds to me like if we could have a concerted effort where you could obtain a return on an agreed set amount of land being put aside, you could actually benefit from that by obtaining and tapping into some of the grants that David talks about. So I think there are benefits, I think, to having a sort of a wider approach to it. Hopefully I answered your question. I'm sorry if I haven't.
No, you won't. No. We love the passion. We love the passion. Nick, please.
Yeah, I think I share the passion too. And I think one of the things that frustrates me is when I hear people at the council say that we don't have any land available for tree planting, because I think, as Tony indicated, you can walk around Bretton, you can walk around Alton, Warrington, particularly the new town areas. There are massive areas of what I call green concrete, which are intensively managed areas of grass, some of which are used for useful purposes, some of which aren't. And one of the things that we asked a few years ago in a motion at full council was for the council to carry out an audit of its land. So I think there is land available for woodland creation. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions really, because just for Tony, you mentioned that PACT is able to get sources of funding for planting. So if the council were to identify areas of land that could be planted, how is there a number of trees that PACT would be able to plant per annum? And also, the other thing when we talk about tree planting that gets thrown back at us is the ongoing maintenance costs of the areas of woodland that are created. So could you comment on it about how that could be funded?
Certainly. So I mean, absolutely, there are ongoing and legacy maintenance costs with tree planting. But actually, when we're establishing a tree in the right place in an open green space, apart from the establishment and ensuring that there's an adequate process of weed suppression, there's very little after that. And so in terms of those costs, as long as they're planned for in the initial delivery plan, I can't see that being too much of a problem. And so when we're allowing a tree to get too big that's not an appropriate species require, you know, qualified tree surgeons to come in, and that's all very expensive. And I think there's an element around ensuring that the right species are chosen, and also is not just precluding those smaller tree species. So, you know, if we were to think, oh, we're going to just plant oaks all across the city, then we're probably, you know, in 25 years' time, we're going to experience quite a lot of legacy maintenance. But if we're planting those smaller shrubs on the periphery of green spaces, how much maintenance will they actually cost? How much will be required? I think probably very little. And I think in terms of where we've obtained our funding, so we're a recipient of the Green Recovery Fund. We can't guarantee those funds all the time. And so, but I think there is a way that I think that the City Council could work to ensure that some of that maintenance, you know, when I did that costing, I'm sure that the professional maintenance crews for the City Council could deliver that more quickly and much cheaply than we could as an organisation that are using volunteers to deliver all of our programmes.
Yeah, just a quick follow up on that, because I agree with you that, you know, in terms of woodland planting, there is an initial cost for the first few years in weed suppression, but then there shouldn't be massive costs from that point onwards. But on the final slide that you showed, there was a figure on there about a maintenance cost per tree of £16. Now, is that woodland trees? Because that seems really high if that's woodland trees, or is that planting in individual trees?
So that was urban trees based on a 10-year period, and so some of that was the following weed suppression that needs to take place to ensure that there's adequate establishment. Some of that will also be that there, as David mentioned, that there are losses. So overplanting tree numbers in an area means that there's probably a better chance of them establishing, but also is that some of those may, you know, for instance, we experience some very hot, dry springs, and so sometimes, you know, they may that there might be more tree losses as a result of that if there's no bowser or something like that available. And so if we were to lose trees, it would be advantageous to pick those losses up in the early stages of any planting program. And so having closer attention to maintenance over the early period of the tree's establishment would be prudent. But again, I think I mentioned that those costings were using volunteers, and so the output of volunteers is probably generally less than you would expect professionals. So if we were involved with the City Council's contractors, and we had mechanical means of suppressing them, you know, most of our public engagement events is done, you know, old school hand tools, and so that's slow and not necessarily the most efficient. But that's not necessarily where our priority lies with the maintenance. It's about maintaining the relationship with the people who got involved with the planting is the primary sort of driver of those follow-up maintenance sessions. And so, and it might also be about public awareness generation about trees in the wider context, and also about maybe it might be involved in a upskilling program as well. So people are coming and learning new skills, and they're learning a little bit more about the environment and what the services that the environment contributes to them. And it also might be, it might be a family day as well. So when we're trying to balance all of those elements of a sort of a follow-up planting, a maintenance day, the efficiency of how many trees we maintain probably starts to drop down the list of priorities there. Hopefully that answered your question, Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, it only was that figure based on woodland planting or planting in individual?
Sorry, that was based on urban planting. So that was all of those costs are based on a planting model that would be suitable for the urban environment planting scheme within the city. But there are ways that I'm sure we could. I mean, it's a broad stroke cost that, and I wouldn't want to be held. If we were to be deliver a project, that those costs could come down. I'm absolutely sure of it. But we would probably have to shift the priorities. So maybe less open public events, and maybe a more highly skilled set of volunteers. So if we were to establish a volunteer set that went round specifically looked at tree maintenance, they would be much more efficient than that broad brush costing that I've put in there. But that essentially is what the sort of the projects that we deliver, or the methods that we deliver.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I think you're saying the right species in the right location, planted at the right time. Councillor Robinson, please.
Hello, thank you. I wanted to follow up on the kind of a point that Nick raised earlier about sort of availability of spaces within Peterborough for tree planting. I know kind of ideas spring to my mind, or we've got, like Nick said, we've got an awful lot of kind of mowed grass, squares and triangles and things very close to me on my side of the city. And I wonder if perhaps PECT do you have in mind areas where you think, oh, if only that didn't belong to PCC, we could perhaps get some trees on there? Because I imagine we'll be told, oh, well, our offices, it would take ages to identify all the spots where you could fit some more trees on. Do you have a kind of, either in your head or actually sort of properly mapped out where expansion could happen?
So we have an ongoing list of target sites. So some of those sites that we've been worked at before that can still be, that accommodate further planting schemes. Some of those are brought to the attention of PEC through the public. Some of those are brought to PEC's attention through councillors asking if we can get involved. And so what happens is we're PEC, we're licensed cultivation licensed to cultivate, and we have an ongoing license with the Forest for Peterborough project. And so those areas get added to as we go through the permission. So we'll apply for permission to plant on the site, and so we've got some more sites that will become available in this autumn. And we've also got sites that have not yet been approved, so they've gone for approval, and so those maps have gone out. And so we'll have an ongoing programme of sending mapped areas to the council's mapping, who will carry out those service checks to make sure there's not big gas mains, or that they actually own the land or so. And so we'll have this ongoing dialogue with the council. And so we find it's all the council's our partner in this. We're working together to deliver the trees, but that process takes its time, and so we have to go through that process, and so it can be time consuming. So the overall process, if we were to upscale the planting, say if we wanted to do those 12,000 trees, would to ensure that we don't get a drag, we'd have to upscale the way that we enter those maps, and the sites get selected. But we are an organisation that will go out and will survey a site, and if it's brought to our attention, and we'll then proceed with trying to obtain permission to plant trees on it, or a multitude of different things like wildflowers.
Thank you. And I've got one other question, if that's all right, Nigel. So I see that some cities have developed a tree action plan in their efforts to kind of reach higher targets of tree planting. So what would your be advice if Peterborough City Council had a tree action plan? What would you think should be the top sort of first priority actions to have on such a plan?
I think it would be helpful to have a broad commitment to a planting figure. I think Councillor Sanford has pushed for sort of a figure to ensure that there's a target that we can work towards. But I think the capacity to work with the council's departments to ensure that we can go and audit the potential sites. You know, there's sites within the council's own departments that they know are available that we could plant trees on together, or that it could partner a tree planting programme. So some of that might be with the council's own contractors, but it could also equally be with members of the public, you know, so that, which would be fantastic too.
So that would be kind of collaboration then. So one of the things we've got to prioritise is certain council departments working more collaboratively with groups such as yourself. Absolutely,
but I would certainly add that I'm not suggesting that there isn't a good partnering relationship already. It's just that that programme is set as a priority. Going, you know, we want to plant, you know, this number of trees, and we want to plant it by, you know, 2030. You know, taking on PEC's target of 230,000 trees that would be a significant and ambitious target, and one that I think we could all work towards and actually achieve. So I think that there's a target there already, you know, adopting PEC's target of that number of trees, and then working away. I think that the thing is to pick up on David's presentation, is that it seems like if you can obtain, if your strategy can isolate these areas rather than us putting them forward and applying them singly, if you link them all together, you've got a capacity to generate a return on that, by a return on the expenditure that's being made. And I think that's the important thing, is that linked process could actually yield a significant saving or a way to cover the majority of those costs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. When you identify these areas, generally, do you get a good outcome?
Yeah, I mean, there has to be a good reason why we don't get permission. Maybe it's not at the scale of it. I think it's also when we go to the survey process, I can pretty much look at the site and go, this would not be suitable for tree planting. You know, you can imagine like a small green space between that has houses on all sides. You know, if it's being used for play, you know, for children playing football on, and there's people's gardens that are backing onto that area, we probably wouldn't want to plant trees right in the back of people's gardens. I think it would be quite antisocial to do that. And so, and you wouldn't necessarily want to plant trees directly in the centre to preclude the children from playing their football games. And so it's trying to work how the grounds are being used at the moment. You know, there are some big areas, open green spaces that can accommodate trees, and in fact there are a number of benefits from doing that. You know, in my slide I make comment around stabilising temperatures. You know, as the ambient temperatures increase, and are suggested to increase across as climate change takes hold. I know there's some research from coming across from Europe that suggests that temperatures can be regulated down by 15 degrees in an urban environment. And so 15 degrees is a significant temperature drop if you can establish trees. One, you've got to be able to establish the trees in the first place, and so that's probably more difficult in a highly built up environment, but not impossible. But those types of things, and also is that in these green spaces you've got the capacity to have, you know, avenues of trees that go around. You know, if they use widely for dog walkers or people walking and exercising in, having the capacity to jog under the dappled shade of trees or walk their dogs and be protected from some of those increasingly high temperatures would be of benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicole, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tony, for your presentation. You mentioned in one of your slides that you work with schools, local communities and businesses. I was just interested to find out, does this work involve both the tree planting and the maintenance of tree? And do you have any prospects to further engage schools, local businesses and communities and actually the maintenance of trees, especially to help cut down costs?
Yes, yes on all of those accounts. So we target schools as a place to generate the awareness building. So we like to link in with schools. We have an education lead who does forest school, and so as a part of that, we help establish forest school suitable areas within the school, so they've got their own resources. But also in terms of skills workshops, we worked with a school in Northborough. We planted trees with the students, and then later on this year we'll be going back and working with volunteers and volunteers to ensure that they understand how to prune to British standards 3998, and ensure that when they are involved in that tree planting, that the quality of workmanship is high, and so that will ensure that the trees aren't unwittingly damaged by maintenance like poor tree pruning or inappropriate trimming that debarks the trees and stuff. So we do work with the community, and we want to maintain those sorts of elements as an upskilling part of the overall awareness generating projects.
Thank you.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Yeah, thank you, Tony. That's fantastic. Yeah, really appreciate your presentation and all the answers to all the questions. Really appreciated. Thank you very much.
I apologise again for the technical flaws.
No need to apologise whatsoever, I can assure you. Okay, over to Russell Horsey. Sorry to keep you waiting, and thank you for your patience, Russell.
Not a problem. Just let me share some screen. I should check you can all see that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. So thanks for inviting me to talk. I'm a chartered arboriculturalist. So I spent 25 years of my career to date basically managing urban trees in cities across the UK, and I've also worked out in America. I'm going to come at it not looking at sort of woodland and whips planting. My come and take home is looking more at standard planting, basically. But I will also touch quite a lot actually on community engagement, because that's been a massive part of my career, and I think there's a massive opportunity, picking up from what we heard from previous speakers, to do that. So in the picture there, we've got trees in a nursery. The trees you see there, they've been within the nursery probably 10 years before council's looking to buy them. They've probably been lifted 4 or 5 times. They're being pruned very heavily, and they're decent sized trees. And then what we hope within 40 to 50 years is we start to see trees like the ones on the right, decent sized street trees that are providing massive benefits. I'd like to reiterate, I think, what both the previous 2 speakers have said in terms of planning. Planning is a key thing. There's a lot of councils at the moment running off, declaring climate emergencies, coming out with lots of numbers, and they don't necessarily have the information. Can they actually go and plant those numbers? And I think actually time spent preparing, time spent making sure you've got the space to do it is key. And this is an example from San Francisco, where I first worked, where even within 10 years, well-defined, managed trees that have gone in start to have an instant impact. And in America, it's all about shade. Trees do lots of things, but the big push in America historically is, and still is, about shade. And that's going to become more and more important here. I think we can also learn quite a lot from the States. There's a lot more volunteer programs, and cities are a lot more happy to let volunteers do a lot more. So I used to take volunteers out to do triage, where we used to do young tree maintenance with the volunteers. They'd remove stakes and guards, they'd upright a tree. We were actually planting in some streets, with volunteers. So, these things can be done, but I think we've been very hesitant in many cases to want to try and do that in this country. I'm going to take you through a journey. I managed the team at Bristol for 7 years. During that time, when I first started, we were planting 100 standard trees a year, and by the end of it, we were planting 1,200 trees a year. So it shows that you can upscale and you can do it over a relatively short time, but it's got to be an incremental step, okay? It also needs to be resourced, whether you resource that internally or whether you resource that through partners. You know, there are lots of grants out there. Many of them don't come with staffing resources. And actually, as a city, if you're going to make the most of these grants, you need to look to resource somewhere to get the most from it, to make sure that, you know, the money you're bidding from is helping the city. So the way we did that in Bristol was we had teams dedicated to managing our housing stock, specific officers managing our highway stock, woodland stock, and we broke our portfolios down in terms of management. We also separated out within our management stock money for planting, and that was really important to us to show the public that we were actually spending money on regenerating. When I started at Bristol, we were losing highway trees, and we didn't have the significant amounts of money at the time. We didn't even have any funding for highways replacements. So I think actually looking at your you know, where you're spending your money and putting aside dedicated money for planting is key. But you can then work with communities and you can work with businesses to raise further money. But actually, there's a lot of money out there for capital infrastructure around highways. And actually, that's something I'll touch on right at the end of my presentation. There's a lot of money that's been talked about from Forestry Commission and from DEFRA, but actually it pales into significance when you look at the money available for transportation schemes. So if you're clever with your transport bids in terms of cycle funding, bus funding, actually you can potentially use that to do a lot of the heavy lifting. You know, planting trees in the highway is not cheap when we start to have to excavate. So, you know, using some of this money can help you do that. It's really important to look at resource mapping and knowing what you've got. So top left is you know, our database 10 or 15 years ago, really basic, but we knew where our trees were, we knew who owned them. Things have moved on massively now. You know, we can start to look at trees, we can start to monetize the benefits, we can start to measure water runoff, we can start to measure pollution capture. You know, so if you've got the right database, you can start to interrogate. You can even start to say, well, okay, if we want to plant these areas, you know, what are the benefits? What are the benefits of planting large trees at greater spacings versus lots of smaller trees? So using technology will help you as a council make better decisions, I think. And I just want to quickly show something in terms of, there's been a few questions around sort of mapping and how do we do things. Technology's moved on massively even in the last 5 years. There's a lot of work going on now in the States, and we're just starting to do that here with a number of councils where we're starting to look at cities from using aerial imagery. We're starting to take out areas. The areas in red on this map are buildings, you know, the areas in grey are roads. You can start to look at, you know, ward levels. So, you know, you've got some of your interesting canopy stuff. You can start by taking out areas that you can't plant to actually work out, is it physically possible? So while some of your wards may have 17% and some have 5%, as has previously been mentioned, if the rest of that area is impervious and you can't plant it, it's going to be really expensive. So again, by using technology, you can start to look at everything. You can start to look at different data sets from people like the NHS, and you can start to better see where you're going to be able to plant. And I think, you know, if you're going to help the previous speaker, doing an exercise like this could be really helpful in terms of streamlining that process rather than looking things on a sort of little bit by little bit basis. Costs for big trees are a lot more. An average cost today for a standard street tree, sort of we're talking about 16 to 18 centimeters, so they're between 4 and 5 meters in height. They're about £150 each at the moment. And there is a shortage. I'm sat actually at a nursery. I've been down here today picking trees for a community group. And I already now, you know, we're not even in early summer, I can't get trees I want for next winter. Okay, the nurseries are having to invest 10, 12 years in some of these trees to get them through to this size. So again, for nurseries to be able to invest more and to grow, because it's not a cheap process, councils need to move away from spot buying of trees and start to enter longer term agreements so that nurseries can start to invest. There are lots of community nurseries going on with smaller whips, and the Welsh Government this year has given a lot of funding to help fund a lot of community nurseries. So, you know, it can be done, but when you start to move to these bigger street trees, it's much more expensive. You know, you need to put stakes, you need to put guards down. You know, we don't have the same issues with rabbits, we don't have the same issues, you know, with animals, but we do have issues with humans snapping trees. So it's worth investing in, you know, guards, but these things can be recycled. It's worth investing in things like a tree pan to try and stop your trees from being trimmed. Again, once you've invested in it, you can reuse it. Watering costs massively vary. For a tree of this size, you're looking at needing to spend at least 3 years watering to get these trees established. And that can massively vary. And one of the issues I see with a lot of councils we work with is historically tree planting has been part of a much bigger contract, and tree planting was never going to be a large part of that contract, so rates are quite high. So actually, because of you're looking to declare a climate emergency and doing more trees, it may well be worth looking at reissuing tenders and re-looking at how you tender to get your rates down. I spoke to a county council recently in the Midlands, and at the moment they're paying £25 a visit to water a tree across the county because they're not planting enough trees. So they know they're going to have to go out and retender that contract if they want to start to plant a lot more trees. And one of the things they're looking at doing there is they're going to basically work on a district basis. And so in year one, they'll work in 1, 2, 3 district. And again, this will help bring their rates down. So again, it's just little things like that, that when their initial contract went out, they weren't doing significant amounts of stuff, but there are ways you can bring it down. So at the moment, you are looking at around £500 mark over 3 years to establish a tree like that and get it established. But it is worth the investment. One of the things that you will come across, and this is the need to take other professionals with you. Okay, some of your officers will have had bad experiences of trees. Your highways officers may well have had bad experiences of trees. On the left is an example of a cherry. Historically, cherries were put on really poor rooting stocks that got even bigger than the trees, and that led to damage to highways. The nurseries have now moved away from that. They're using much better root stocks. Highways engineers may not know that. So actually, if I turn around to a highways engineer and say, I want to put cherries in this street, they may be like, no, please, because that's their experience. So actually, we need to work with other professionals across the council in order to take them on the journey with us. And that's a big part of what we did at Bristol. We also had to look at, what trees have we got? There's no point in planting lots more lime. So Tilly across Europe here is a lime. 18% of Bristol's street tree stock when I took over was lime. That's a massive issue. If we get a pest or disease comes in, we could lose almost 20% of our trees overnight. So actually, it's really important to have the figures in terms of what you've got to make sure that not everyone is just planting oak trees, because what you don't want to have is a disease that comes in, like we've now seen with ash dieback, and killing that stock. So again, facts and figures in terms of what you're replanting is really important. At Bristol, we recognised that we weren't planting enough trees, and so we set up a charity. And it was a city-run program called Tree Bristol, and it was about planting heavy standards. We also had a not-for-profit, the Forest of Avon, which did a lot of our woodland planting, but actually the city wanted to invest in standards. It wanted to invest in large trees. And it wasn't just on streets. And I think this is a really important thing that I've learned during my career. If you can see a tree from a street, residents think it's a street tree. It doesn't matter whether it's on parks land, it doesn't whether it's housing land. And actually planting in parks or housing land can sometimes be significantly cheaper than planting on the highway. And actually planting further away from the highway means you get less risk to the highway, and you potentially can have a bigger tree. It's about picking the right tree in the right place. So this is a map at the time, and the green trees are what was planted in the 70s. And what you saw in the 70s was a lot of forestry planting of trees too close together. There was never any money to thin the trees out. And actually, it's quite problematic thinning trees out after 15 years because there's nothing wrong with them. They look really good and the public don't like it. So people tend to shy away from it. So the yellow dots you can see are starting to plant at final spacings. So that meant if we were putting in large scale trees, we put 15 to 20 meters between each tree. It meant we planted less trees, but actually in terms of getting a better canopy cover, it gave us more opportunity to get bigger canopy cover. The trees were less stressed. They had much more greater space. So in terms of future management costs, some of the reason that your tree officers have got headaches from the 70s is because too many trees were planted and there was never enough money to thin. We can stop that happening now by planting at better spacings. It means with these trees, apart from the need to remove some lower branches to get them up above people's heads, actually those trees can just be left to grow. There's not the cost of coming into thin. There's not, expensive costs when trees are growing too close together, so they die quicker. So again, by being smarter, it meant we planted less, but we invested more in each tree to make sure they were established. So we did this 3-year program of watering and maintenance to make sure the trees took. Look for quick wins. There's no point in spending lots of money trying to dig up the pavement when you've got a perfectly good grass verge. Okay. But species of trees have changed. So on the right hand side here, we've got a very upright form of cherry. So that, when the Victorians planted, and even in the 70s, there was much less choice. The nurseries have worked really hard over the last 20 years to provide us with more choice. So there are lots of different species and there are lots of different types in terms of size and shape. And so what we did as officers was we went to this is Reedley Road, and we did a consultation. And it's really important when you're going back to streets to try and put trees in that you do a consultation with people. But the consultation was around, we want to plant trees. They're good for this reason. And this is we're going to give you a choice of 3 trees that we as officers think will fit and are not going to cause problems for the council to manage. And then the residents chose which of the 3 species they want with and we planted. We planted this site over 4 years. And actually in the first year, we had residents that said, I don't want a tree because their experiences of trees have been bad. By year 3, they were coming to us going, actually, the trees are lovely. Can you come back and can you plant outside our house? So, you know, that again is about taking the public with you. When I started at Bristol, we had a donation scheme where people could choose the tree they wanted. They could choose a space it went into, and it was a disaster. People were putting too bigger trees or wanting to put too bigger trees into smaller places, or they were wanting to put in a tiny tree where there was a space for a big tree. So it's really important that you use your professional officers to just sort of help you define what fits that space, but then by all means go out and work with residents to engage, you know, invite residents to come and water these trees to help them get established. As I said, planting trees, you know, in verge is quite cheap. Planting trees in the highway, it can get really expensive. Just to plant this tree costs us around £5,000 to do the engineering works. Okay, now this is a great tree. It's going to be amazing. It's plain tree. You know, it's going to produce great canopy. It's never going to be hit by anything. You know, it's miles away. It's not going to get vandalized. But actually putting traffic management in to get that tree put in cost us a fortune. Doing the design work to get that in cost us a fortune. So putting trees into tarmac, unless they're funded by big government capital schemes, could easily drain your money very, very, very quickly. It's really important to involve the community. Tree Bristol was all about involving the community. It was officer-led, but we got schools out, we got residents out, we worked with businesses, okay? And sometimes actually that's really important. We had parks with antisocial behaviour, we were getting vandalism. By getting kids involved, by getting local people involved, our vandalism dropped off. You know, it became much less of an issue. We were losing very few trees, but actually sometimes it was about encouraging kids to come into the park. You know, actually the tree planting was a secondary element. Some of these children didn't even know this park existed, and they may have lived 3 or 4 streets away. And we're seeing less and less children getting into our park. So community planting can be really good. The photo at the bottom is in Northampton, where we're currently working, and residents have raised money. So, all right, it's a Photoshop. We haven't let the residents go and plant in the tarmac, but the residents have raised the money to plant those trees. So residents are really keen across the UK. We're seeing that they want to raise money and they want to see more trees going back into their streets. So work with them, let them help you find funding. They can apply for funding that councils can't. Get businesses involved. Businesses love tree planting. It's good PR for them, you know, and you know, many of them have to give back to the community. So so why wouldn't they want to sponsor a tree? And that's not just giving you money, that's also get staff out. You know, if you come up with a design for a site that takes 50 trees, that could take quite a while with a contractor. But if you get people out and you supervise them, that can go in a day straight away. We need to do more promotion. This is David Bellamy. We need to find some younger people to promote to get to more people. You know, David's probably getting on a bit now, but you know, at the time David came out, he helped us plant. The gentleman on the right there's one of my housing association officers. He became my biggest champion within the housing department to get trees in terms of he would go out of his way to talk to residents, to encourage residents to come out and plant, and that helped us break down barriers on our housing sites, again to decrease vandalism and get better take up and trees going in. It's really important to procure a healthy UK grown tree, and I can't reiterate that more. There are many nurseries in the UK that sell UK trees, but they have been imported, and they may have been held here for a month, a year, but they have been imported. And we've seen with diseases like cholera on ash, we've seen it with elm disease, you know, importing trees is not good. And again, this is why working with nurseries that produce UK trees is really important, but you need these long-term supply chains to make sure that they can deliver, you know, so that you're not spot buying and you know, designing schemes and not having trees to go in. And then, as I said, one of the areas that's currently missed, and we did very well at this, was integrating trees on green infrastructure. This is an example from Germany where basically the trees go in, the infrastructure goes in, and then they do the buildings. This is the UK example where the trees all get ripped out, the infrastructure gets put in, and then potentially some whips get put back in, and we need to move away from this. It's not good. This is a bus-guided tramway in Cambridge where, you know, all the green vegetation was taken out and what went back in was nowhere near compensating what's lost. And so we need to be aware that capital infrastructure schemes for bus routes, for cycle routes, have the potential to do a lot of damage, but they also have the potential to do a lot of good if you do your bids right. Bristol was very successful in winning money through our cycle city, and we became one of the first cycle cities in the UK. And we use that to start to plant trees along cycle routes. We recognized that we had to make the routes nice as well as quick in order to encourage people. We then took that philosophy across when we bid for government funding, and we bid for £42 million to basically improve 10 bus routes. And then we were given £450,000. Well, initially it was £500,000, but budgets were cut, and we took £450,000 and we planted trees on those bus routes. And to me, that was massive. My annual budget previously was £120,000 a year. So to suddenly be given £450,000 over 2 years to plant trees was massive. It meant we could do more. It meant we could try new things. It meant I could afford to open up these tree pits that were really expensive and difficult. And partly it was also good because we started to get a better understanding and working with our highways colleagues. We got to understand, what was important to them, and they understood what was important to us. And we also were working with businesses along these routes to say, trees are good. There's research out there that shows that tree-lined streets, make people in shopping precincts stop and spend more money. So, we talked to businesses, they understood this. And by digging up the highway in order to put in new pavements and in order to put in new bus shelters, we found more spots to put trees in. So, retrofitting a scheme after it's gone in costs thousands, whereas actually if you're already digging up the highway anyway, and if you have the gentleman there is my dedicated officer, and he spent 2 years just working on bus routes, finding spaces for trees to go in. Okay, and it was very much money well spent. If we'd have tried to go in and retrofit, it would have cost us millions to retrofit. So making use of these capital schemes is really good. We changed the perception from highways. Highways were concerned that we couldn't put trees in the central reservation because cars would run into them. We did. It didn't happen. We designed it so that the trees were able to take runoff because there was a runoff issue. We chose species of trees that could cope with salt, so there weren't issues. So again, it's just about listening to highways and just seeing how things were done. Traffic management is one of the most expensive thing about trying to plant highway trees. So we changed the way we worked. Previously, the highways department would come along, they would do all the hard engineering works, their traffic management would disappear. I'd pay for traffic management to go in, and we put the trees in. We were paying double the costs. So we said, look, we're all part of the same project. Can we put the trees in before you put the final layer in on your highway? It'll save the whole project money and we can get more trees in. And they said yes. And what I also learned by doing that is because we were using quite sandy soils, highways don't like new paving to be full of sand and soils because it stops the road working effectively. So by changing our working practices, they were much happier with the outcome. And that's the kind of finished scheme. And by working with the engineers and them listening to businesses and getting feedback over the 2 years we worked with them, trees became part of the high quality design, whereas previously the high quality design was just about new paving blocks, just about bus shelters, just about bollards. And trees have become an ingrained thing in Bristol. We've shown in Bristol that basically rather than putting a bollard in, if you put a tree in, you get less overrun because vehicles are less likely to mount the curb. So actually now in Bristol, whenever they put a new build out in, they put a tree in instead of a bollard. It saved the highways department money in terms of having to replace bollards, and it meant we've got more trees in without having to pay for expensive pits. There isn't one brilliant way of designing. There's lots of different ways of designing trees. So it's about looking at each situation. I see a number of councils that have the way we plant trees in the highway. If you've only got one or two ways of planting in the highway, it's very easy for people to say, no, you can't do it. So you need to have a number of different ways and be open to different interpretations. So in the previous, we were doing individual pits. In this case, we did a long linear pit. We put a cycle route next to it. And what you can see there is a root barrier. We've put trees on the other side of the root barrier. There's lots of rooting space to them on the left, but we've put in that barrier to stop the footpath from being damaged in the future. We've also worked with our engineers so that they got to understand, highways works continues all year. When you're putting standard trees in, November to March is is your period. If a highway scheme runs on, cap the pit, come back to it next year. And we've got the engineers to understand that, but we hadn't explained that to the public. And the public, with this case, was saying, well, hang on a second, you haven't finished it. When are you going to come back and finish putting the paving in? So my colleague came out with a tree Banksy, and basically we were using it to promote Tree Bristol, saying there's a tree coming here soon. And it meant we stopped all the complaints. So, just a little thing so the public understand what's going on. They understand it's not finished, and they can move forwards. When we finished, the last thing we did was White Ladies Roads. For those of you that know Bristol, it's the kind of main thoroughfare from the Downs down into the city centre. It was a massive rat run. It's about 5 lanes wide. And there was a big push from Sustrans. They wanted cycle routes up and down each side. And we said, look, they don't work. There's an issue here of people getting knocked over. we want to put massive tree pits in. We want to slow the traffic down so it runs more consistently. It'll make it feel safer for cyclists. And we showed them some of the research and work that's been done in the States, and they took a risk and they went with us. And actually, it meant we got much bigger tree pits in, which meant we put much bigger trees. Used the tree pits to pedestrians, so basically crossing points in between the trees. Okay, we got bigger trees and brand new limes and planes, and there was no room on either verge to put these in existing pavements because they were full of services. And so that was a win. And I found out afterwards, actually, our highways guys had been listening to us, because what I didn't realize was that usually in these type of pits, they'd have an uplight, but they'd understood that we wanted more soil space, and they decided they didn't need an uplight. So they took the uplights away. So we got more space. And, if you go there now, the trees have been in 15 years. They're getting really big. They're starting to provide shade. What we also know is that where you get tree canopies that overtop a road, it keeps traffic down. So the number of accidents has decreased there. The number of cyclists has gone up. On that route, the number of cyclists has now gone up 13%. We had feedback afterwards that cyclists that were always too frightened to go out onto that road were starting to use it. Our bus numbers went up our bus numbers went up so much, the bus companies didn't want us to publish the research. Okay, similar schemes where they hadn't incorporated green infrastructure, we're seeing 2 or 3% increases in bus usage. We saw 40% increase on these routes. Okay, so we've got to encourage people back onto public transport post-pandemic, and actually you've got to make these places nice. You've got to make people want to sit on a bus, and trees and green infrastructure is one of the ways we can do that. So that's a very quick insight into sort of working with trees. Any questions, please?
Yeah, thank you for that, Russell. Very interesting. Councillor Day, please.
Thank you, Russell. I'm just going to say, wow, that was just incredible. So many ideas. I've got a couple of questions. First of all, so Peterborough was developed in the 70s, and I actually grew up in the area that I represent, which has a lot of shelter belt, which is very close to people's gardens, and exactly as you described, it's not been thinned out. When the Development Corporation built, they planted the wrong type of trees, and you're absolutely right. It gives our officers, I think, a real headache. We are looking at maybe making some tweaks to the woodland and tree strategy for those particular areas. How would you say that you can, obviously you've given some ideas, how would you say that you can overcome and really encourage, because that's what the fear is that, planting more trees will mean more costs. And as Councillor Sanford said at the beginning, it's always the costs that are thrown back at us as to reasons as to why we can't. So what sort of things would you be saying to officers or doing? I mean, obviously, I hope officers watch this as well.
Yeah.
Question.
There's no getting away from it. If you plant hundreds of thousands more trees, your costs are going to go up. However, if you plant smartly, you can minimize those costs. By planting trees at final spacings, you get away from all those issues of having to go and thin, and that's where the expense is. Traffic management is horrific. So, again, planting trees that have got enough space to grow into in their lifetime and planting them well means hopefully you won't have to go back. So to me, it's a much smarter. We did some research in Bristol because we had a lot of pollarded historic limes and planes in streets that really couldn't cope with them due to subsidence. We were getting lots of claims against them, and we actually did some research, and we basically did a cost benefit over a 40-year period and worked out that if for every one of those trees we had to remove anyway because of subsidence, if we replaced it with a medium-sized tree, we actually got a greater canopy, and we could plant 3.5 trees for every pollard we remove. Now, that's not to say I'm advocating taking out every pollard you've got, but actually where you are taking out trees, don't replace with like for like. I see too many people still replacing with like for like. So it's about being smart. We did a lot of work on design. So the parks we hit, we did like a 5-year planting plan. We did an awful lot of design work. We were putting in new avenues, but again, they were going in at these final spacings, recognizing that we didn't have the money. We weren't envisaging having to come back in and do a lot of tree work. And actually, you've got the great community groups you've got here. Train them up to do that pruning. That low pruning, that kind of stuff is invaluable. Can they help you by removing those stakes and guards at the end of the 3 or 4 years the trees have been established, so that they get recycled? Because that work is costly to a contractor sometimes. And whereas if you work with a community group, it can be a lot better. You know, investing in an apprentice who can drive a van to take people out and do that might be another way of doing it. I think there's a lot of opportunity to work with residents, but you will have to invest in more staff yourself if you want the best out of it. And I think, to me, that's the fundamental. You know, as you say, your officers are dealing with a historic legacy. That isn't going to change. So, but if we design well, we won't be having that same legacy in 30, 40, 50 years' time.
Thank you for that, Russell.
Okay.
Nick.
Yes, thank you very much for that presentation. Really quite a large amount of information that we need to have a look at. I was particularly taken by your comments about using opportunities to plant in grass verges, because one of the things that we have in Peterborough is quite a big problem with grass verges being churned up by cars parking on them. And what we've done in our ward is each year we get a small amount of what's called community leadership fund, and we have used some of that to plant trees in grass verges, and it can actually help with that problem. I also take your point about, you know, using opportunities when the council's putting in bits and major infrastructure projects to incorporate trees as part of that. But you know, the question that we're always going to be asked if we advocate more tree planting is this idea of, you know, how much it's going to cost. And I think you've explained quite clearly that planting street trees and individual trees is much more costly. So you did mention that there are different sources of grant aid that could be applied for. So could you actually outline some of those? And also, one of the ideas that's specifically been suggested in Peterborough is that we get commercial companies to sponsor trees. So do you have any examples of local authorities that have actually done something?
Yeah, so through Tree Bristol, you were able to sponsor a tree and different levels. At the time, we had a bronze, silver, and gold leaf, and the gold leaf meant you paid for everything. The silver leaf made you got part of a tree. We sent a certificate out to people. We had an online wall so that it was a memorial. One of the things I wouldn't advocate is putting plaques in or stuff, because you tend to find you get more vandalism, and businesses love that too because they could see what they were doing. Don't undersell what your costs are. I think we made that mistake in Bristol in that we lowered our price thinking we'd get more sponsorship, but actually it started to drain on revenue budgets, because, you know, you will lose some trees and those people expect those trees to be replaced if they get lost. So, you know, if your cost is £500, charge £525 to cover your losses, to make sure it's not draining on your revenue budgets. I think that's really important. In terms of where you've got vehicles parking on verges, unless you take the residents with you, it's highly unlikely that those trees will survive, because they're just going to get run into. So you may need to look at different types of infrastructure. Actually, I think there's a thing, and I've not seen this much over here, you know, I think there's a need for a front garden forest. You know, when you look at the cost of putting street trees in, and if they're going to potentially get damaged by vehicles, would it not be better for the councils to invest in a tree that can go in someone's front garden? And I'd advocate that the residents buy half the tree, and that the city gives money for half the tree. But get them to buy in, teach them how to look after the tree, and potentially you can have street trees then in people's gardens, and that might be a quicker way of dealing with that until you deal with the parking issue. So I think that's one way. There's lots of money available. There's lots of charities out there. The Woodland Trust is one. They've got their Urban Tree Challenge. They've got their Emergency Tree Fund. Trees for Cities is always looking for partners. But again, a lot of these projects, they're all coming with funding to put the trees in and this, that, and the other. Unless you've got the staff behind it, you're not going to make the most of those bids. You know, we've got the Urban Tree Challenge Fund out there at the moment. There was a specific fund for unitary authorities and county councils. Sorry, I've forgotten the name of it off the top of my head, which is closed. So, you know, I can't, government isn't stopping this type of funding. So, you know, make the most of it. But if I'm honest, it's, you know, a lot of the green funding is tiny compared to the Department for Transport. So I think, you know, look at Department for Transport funding and just make sure an element is that if that is used for greening, because, you know, Department for Transport's budget is, I think it's 10 or 20 times DEFRA's. So, you know, you see the same in terms of capital funding. They spend a lot more money on capital.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Just one further question. what we find in Peterborough, and I'm sure it happens across the country as well, is that particularly street trees, quite a number of them have to be taken out for various reasons. Sometimes for perfectly good reasons, because the tree's got some disease. Sometimes it's for slightly more dubious reasons about the trees pushing up the pavement. But we have a policy here that we only plant one replacement tree for each tree that's taken out. I just wondered, do you think that's adequate, or do you think we should be maybe planting 2 or 3 trees for each one that's
a number of councils are now looking at policies to try and see whether or not they should be planting more. A number of them are doing it mainly for planning reasons. So you see things like Bristol has a tree replacement standard, and basically for every tree that's lost on a development site, between 1 and 8 trees is replaced by the developer, and the developer either replaces it on their own land, or if they can't, they give a commuted sum to the city to replace on the city's land, and that's raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for tree planting across the city. So yeah, again, looking at your planning policies might be a way that you can fund more trees going in, so that you don't lose that canopy cover without being necessarily a burden on the taxpayer. And I think, if you've got enough officers that you can design schemes. So I said initially that when we started, it was kind of, you come to the city and tell us you want a tree in this park, and you can plant it in whichever species you want as long as you give us a bit of money. It didn't work. So Tree Bristol moved to having designs for each park with trees we were happy to maintain, and they were then up for sponsorship. And once the park was full, it was full. We moved on to a different park. So again, if you've got well-designed schemes, the public businesses will buy into it. So again, it's just a way of subsidising it. And the same is now going on in Bristol for street trees. Street tree replacements are being replaced by the public or businesses sponsoring them. So again, if you've got your data correct, you've got a good website, people can literally come and buy a tree in the same way they come and pay their council tax. They just buy a tree instead, and they can say which location it's going in. The key is just to work with your officers to make sure that you're not going to have some of those historical issues again by putting the wrong tree back in that location.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Nicole, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, Russell, for your presentation. The research behind the ideas you have presented this afternoon are brilliant, and I think that's exactly what we're missing at Peterborough City Council. Do you have any suggestions on how we can use procurement to take a more integrated approach in working with our partners and research-led organisations to help to plant more trees, especially around existing infrastructure, as well as in identifying more spaces for future planting?
Quite a lot of the research has already been done. Some of it isn't in the UK. Forest Research is doing some great research, but actually a lot of the research I'm talking about initially came from the States. I don't necessarily think we have to redo that research. We've shown that the American research, it works here without having to do further research. Procurement is a challenge. We're a small business. We're a small consultancy. We specialize in this. We struggle sometimes to A, know contracts and tenders are coming out, and B, to bid for it, because we're just too small. And it tends to go to a lot of the bigger companies, the big engineering companies and all that. And actually, maybe their specialism isn't in those areas. So, are there local companies to you that can do this kind of, this thing? We've already heard from 2 speakers. The second speaker, basically, to me, it sounds like a brilliant opportunity to upskill them, to work with your officers to do this. So, I would work with what you can locally. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Russell. Okay, Nicola.
Thanks. Final couple of questions from me. I'm really interested in cycling in the city, and I've sat on a cycling group, and I've worked with Sustrans quite a bit. It's been really difficult though to get any traction, but I'm really interested in how you put trees. I couldn't quite remember what you said. You put trees along cycle lanes. Did you say it along roads? Did you say that it made cycling safer? And how did you develop that link? Did you just approach Sustrans and say, "Oh, look, let's work together on this"? I just wondered how that came about.
I'll be slightly critical of Sustrans, if I'm honest. They're great at cycling. They don't know much about trees. So historically, where they put cycle routes in, they tend to have gone for a cheap tree mix, which then causes no end of issues. So the Bristol to Bath cycle track is a partly owned city, partly owned Sustrans. They own different sections to stop the utility companies digging it up. And I inherited a mix of poplar trees which were just destroying the cycle path. So we used capital funding on our cycle bid to upgrade the lighting. But we also did that by saying, well, okay, we're going to have to take trees out. We've got trees in the way of lighting columns. We've got trees that are destroying, which are the wrong trees. I don't want to manage them. And so we basically went in and we took trees out, but we also did a lot of planting. So I think part of it again is this, this is where there's often a lack of tree experts involved in these things. There's a lot of engineers, there's a lot of cycling experts, and then the green bit is chucked on at the end. And maybe we've overspent, so we haven't got as much money, and actually it needs to be at the front. You need to have officers that know what they're doing, looking at it, because it can make such a difference. And so yeah, we, with all our cycle routes that we put in across the city, because they were going across parks and we had lots of parks groups that wanted to see more greening, we made sure that any new cycle route that went in across the park had trees, and it was the only way that you were going to get it through the city, because the parks groups were not going to have it without it. So, but we didn't put the trees right up against the cycle path. They were 4 to 5 meters back. We chose species that weren't going to damage it in the future. We put in root barriers. So we were listening to what the cyclists and the engineers were worried about, and then we were designing the trees to fit it. And actually, yes, then we've got, Bristol see massive explosion in cycle routes, but it needs to be safe. So, if you're putting the trees in at 20-meter spacings, people can see between them. I wouldn't be putting woodland belts along, because people get worried that people might jump out and mug them. And that's what historically been happening on some of our cycle routes. So what I found in many councils is that the tree team is generally very small, or your countryside team is very small. They don't have necessarily the capacity, and they're not asked to the table, and that means you miss out. And so one way that you can do this is, if you think about a capital scheme from government, if it's delivered by external consultants, the external consultants charge for their time. So what we did at Bristol was said, okay, rather than employing external consultants, we will employ an extra tree officer. That tree officer will be paid for by the capital project for a 3-year period, and they will then give input into that advice and make sure that stuff is going in that the city can manage. And so in a way, it's just and government's happy doing that, but it's just very rarely seen. People are just used to using this consultancy model, but there's no reason why you can't get more officers in on these projects with the expertise to sit on those boards and sit on those projects. And so yeah, the last one I showed, we saw a 13% increase in cyclists along that route within 5 years, and it was dangerous. I wouldn't have cycled it, and I'm a keen cyclist before that. But what we found is by getting the traffic to be more even, and by the cyclists coming out and the buses weren't racing to get to the next bus stop, it was just felt safer. And it changes it. Otherwise, we could have just put cycle lanes up and down, but it still would have been 5 lanes wide. Cars would still have been racing up and down. So that scheme actually won an award from the local civic society, and the shopkeepers came out and said it's made a massive difference. That's the other thing with a lot of these schemes, is at a time when retail was massively dropping off, on a number of the schemes where we put trees in, retail rebounded, and we saw a change. We saw a nighttime culture become a cafe culture. We saw new shops appearing. It started to regenerate those areas. And so that was, again, the research has told us from the States that will happen, but I'd not come across it in the UK because we'd not had the chance to do it. So again, you can regenerate your out of town shopping areas by making them nice. The research says people will stop where there are trees. People will spend more money where there are trees. They'll stay there longer.
Wow. Just a follow-up question. It sounds like you not only planted more trees, as you showed in your graph, but you also changed the culture at the council in terms of, working with highways and working with Sustrans. Can you say how long that took you, before you did it?
It took a few years. However, we now do a lot of training with different councils where we can do it much quicker. So we've been running specific workshops recently for South Gloucester Council, and we've got everybody in a room. And I think that's what's happened, is historically councils have worked in silos. The highways engineers will have their training, the planners will have their training, the green people will have their training. And what we said is that, so they've also issued a climate emergency, and what they said is we need to get people to work together. And because I've got this experience, we can go in, and when people go, you can't do that, it won't work. Well, no, I can, and it has worked. And then the planners go, oh right, I didn't know that would work. Maybe we should be asking for that. And we do so part of the workshop, we run a number of workshops, and then we also get them to go out and redesign a street after they've heard the workshop. And it's really interesting to see the engineers changing, especially the younger ones that maybe haven't had bad experiences. and they'll go out and redesign things. And in fact, in South Gloucester, they've just won some of the Newtown regeneration money, and part of that will involve putting trees back in, whereas I think prior to doing that, we probably wouldn't have seen that. So the time is right, but you've got to make sure that people from different departments are coming together, and you as a council potentially have to make time for your officers to do that. It's very difficult as an officer when you're just dealing with the day job to sometimes step away and be able to talk to other people. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I loved. I don't know if we can go back to the normal screen now. I don't know if that's
yeah,
possible.
sorry. Yeah, let me do that.
Thank you. Right, that's great. Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, David. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Russell. There's a lot of information for us all to take in, but I think it was a very worthwhile exercise, and I think we can go away and digest all this, and as a group, come back with quite a few ideas, hopefully.
Great.
Anybody else would like to say anything? No one's putting a hand up. Not everybody's shaking their head. I'm sure Lewis Banks enjoyed that. Do you want to say anything, Lewis?
Yeah, I certainly did. Yeah, it was very interesting, wasn't it? So yeah, just so you know, hi everyone, I'm Lewis Banks, Transport and Environment Manager at the City Council. So yeah, we're developing lots of plans for cycling in the city as well. So I was really keen and interested in hearing that last presentation there. So I think that's a key action we can take away is what as part of the infrastructure we're delivering from a highways perspective, what more can we do, I suppose, as part of those schemes, to plant trees and make other biodiversity improvements.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Yeah, especially if there's more funding that way to get more trees. I think it's very encouraging.
Yeah,
really.
that's a good option for us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. I think I'd like to say, Lewis, I think I found Russell's evidence really interesting as well on street trees. And I'm just picturing Lincoln Road with that big pot of money that's still to be spent in the Millfield area. Just checked it out on Google Earth, and there's plenty of room for curbside trees. So I'll leave that one with you, Lewis.
Yeah, and all our cycle routes with planted trees alongside. Great. It sounds really exciting. Okay, Anna, would you like to add anything, please?
Just, I think Councillor Day's got a hand up. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
Oh,
Yes.
I just wanted to ask, I actually, which is really ridiculous, I should have found this out. I don't know how big our tree team is. Obviously, Russell talked a lot about we need the capacity. So if we get the funding, and the grants, we actually need those officers then to deliver some of these projects. Do we know how many people we have on our tree team? And maybe Nick knows. I'm not quite sure, and I should have found that out.
Lewis, is it Darren? Lewis?
It's Darren Sharp, isn't it? He's one of the tree officers.
Yeah, so Darren Sharp's, if you like, the lead officer, I suppose, responsible for it. Quite a bit from the policy and the planning side of things. Obviously, he'll have various contractors that he'll be able to call upon,
Right.
in terms of the maintenance and planting and that kind of thing. And he's also got a dedicated trees officer that works within his team as well, who works on it. Gentleman, I think Stephen. I'm not sure of his surname. So.
Okay.
Yeah,
just
I know Darren's obviously attending the next meeting, isn't he? So that might be a good question for him then, in terms of whether he thinks he's the green resource.
Yeah, just to sort of add to that, the people who look after the council's own trees are people that work for Aragon, which is a wholly owned contractor. So there is a split. I think the people in that Aaron's team tend to deal more with trees on private land, all of the planning issues.
Okay.
Whereas it's actually Aragon that would deal with all of the council trees.
I will ask the question as well at Aragon, if that's okay. Okay, right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I think, it's 17:19. So, let's say good evening to everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day and see everybody soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.